Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's turn to main character. Marry my son, and your family walks away owing us nothing. The words were spoken so calmly that Grant Calloway almost wondered if he had misunderstood them. Across the 40-foot conference room, Harrison Mercer sat beneath the cold glow of the Boston skyline, one hand resting beside a folder containing the numbers that had dismantled Grant's future one red line at a time. $12 million. That was what Calloway Industries owed Mercer Holdings after 18 months of collapsing contracts, rising interest, and decisions Grant's father had hidden until there was almost nothing left to save. Grant kept his shoulders square beneath his charcoal suit. You're asking me to marry someone I've never met. Harrison's expression remained unreadable. I'm offering your family a way out. Grant looked toward his father. Richard Calloway stared at the polished walnut table instead of his son. That silence hurt more than the proposal. If Grant refused, the company his grandfather had built would disappear. Hundreds of employees could lose their jobs. His parents would lose their home. His younger sister would inherit the wreckage of decisions she had never made. Grant slowly returned his attention to Harrison. Your son knows about this? A pause. Small, but noticeable. Julian understands his responsibilities. Grant hated the answer immediately. He hated the room, the contract, and most of all the realization that everyone here expected him to sacrifice his future with the dignity of a man signing a business agreement. If I agree, the debt is cleared? Every dollar. Grant stared through the windows at Boston spread beneath a gray December sky. Somewhere beyond the glass, people were choosing where to eat lunch, whom to call, whom to love. Ordinary freedoms suddenly felt impossibly expensive. Fine, he said. I'll marry him. 3 weeks later, Grant stood beneath the ivory arches of a private Beacon Hill ceremony with a wedding ring in his hand and resentment sitting like stone beneath his ribs. Then Julian Mercer entered. Grant had expected fragility because that was how everyone had spoken about Harrison Mercer's blind Omega heir, with lowered voices and carefully disguised pity. Instead, Julian moved with measured confidence beside the wedding coordinator, his white cane finding the edge of the runner before each controlled step. He wore an impeccably tailored midnight navy suit. Soft black hair rested naturally across his forehead, framing a composed face with high cheekbones, a clean tapered jaw, and blue-gray eyes that did not search for Grant's gaze. Julian stopped beside him. Up close, there was no uncertainty in his posture, only restraint. The ceremony was brief. Their vows sounded like contractual language dressed in prettier words. At the reception, Grant escaped onto a quiet terrace where December air cut through his coat. A moment later, he heard the measured tap of Julian's cane behind him. You don't have to leave your own reception to avoid me, Julian said. Grant turned, embarrassed by how accurately the stranger had read him. I wasn't avoiding you. Julian's mouth shifted with the faintest suggestion of amusement. You're a terrible liar, Grant. Hearing his name in Julian's quiet voice unsettled him. Look, I know what this marriage is. Do you? Julian asked. Grant's jaw tightened. My family's debt bought a wedding. The amusement disappeared. For the first time, something wounded passed across Julian's composed features before being carefully buried. Then understand one thing before we begin. Julian turned toward the sound of Grant's breathing, his expression calm again. I know exactly what they bought with your debt. He paused. It wasn't your love. And in that moment, Grant realized the man he had assumed was benefiting from this arrangement might be the only other person in the world who wanted it as little as he did. Grant discovered the first surprise of his marriage at 7:15 the next morning, when he walked into the breakfast room of Mercer House expecting to find Julian waiting for someone to help him, and instead found his new husband running a multi-million-dollar meeting. Julian sat at the end of a long oak table in a cream cashmere sweater, a discreet wireless earpiece in one ear, while a laptop beside him read financial data through a screen reader at a speed Grant could barely follow. Move the Hartford projection back to the previous quarter, Julian said calmly. The current model assumes a 6% increase in commercial occupancy that the supporting report does not justify. A voice from the computer hesitated. The analysts approved that estimate yesterday. Julian tilted his head slightly. Then the analyst should read page 43 again. Grant stopped near the doorway. Julian had not noticed him, or so Grant assumed. "Good morning, Grant," Julian said without turning. Grant glanced around instinctively. "How did you know it was me?" "Your shoes." Julian ended the call several minutes later and closed his laptop. "You walk faster than my father, but you hesitated doorways." Grant pulled out the chair opposite him. "You memorized my footsteps after one night?" "I pay attention." There was no pride in the answer. It was simply a fact. Grant reached automatically for the coffee pot. "Do you want me to pour you some?" Julian's expression remained pleasant, but something in it cooled. "The pot is 6 inches to my right." "I know because I put it there." Grant withdrew his hand. "Right? Sorry. You do not need to apologize for offering. Just do not assume." That distinction followed Grant throughout the morning. He watched Julian move through Mercer House without the helplessness everyone had quietly taught Grant to expect. Julian counted steps only in unfamiliar areas. He used subtle tactile markers on important controls. His phone announced messages through an earpiece, and documents arrived in accessible digital formats. When they left for Mercer Holdings shortly before 10, Julian used his white cane across the marble lobby while employees greeted him by name. He recognized voices. Almost immediately, more unsettling to Grant was how much Julian remembered about the people behind them. He asked one employee whether her daughter had recovered from the flu and congratulated another on finishing graduate school. By noon, Grant was seated beside him in a conference room overlooking downtown Boston, while 6 executives presented quarterly results. Grant understood enough corporate finance to follow the discussion, but Julian seemed to hear weaknesses inside the numbers themselves. "Stop," Julian said suddenly. The room fell silent. "Read the operating expense figure again." The chief financial officer repeated it. Julian leaned back. "That is not the figure from the report distributed Monday." Papers rustled around the table. Grant opened the document on his tablet. Julian was right. The difference was nearly $800,000. Grant looked at him differently after that. Julian could not see the surprised faces surrounding him, but he appeared to sense the change in the room. Later, inside the private elevator, Grant finally spoke. "You remembered that number?" "Numbers are easier than people," Julian replied. Then his expression became thoughtful. "Although people reveal more when they think you cannot see them." The elevator descended quietly. Julian turned his face toward Grant. "For example, you stopped breathing normally when they mentioned Callaway Industries." Grant felt his stomach tighten. Julian's voice remained gentle, which somehow made the question harder to escape. "The debt in our marriage agreement is not the entire debt, is it?" Grant stared at the descending floor numbers, suddenly understanding something far more dangerous than his own prejudice. Julian Mercer did not need sight to know when someone was hiding the truth. Grant did not answer until the elevator doors opened onto the private executive floor. Julian remained beside him, one hand resting lightly around the handle of his white cane, his expression composed enough to make Grant's silence feel louder than an admission. "Not here," Grant finally said. Julian gave a small nod. "Your office or mine?" 20 minutes later, they were alone inside Julian's office with the door closed and the Boston skyline hidden behind pale winter clouds. Grant stood near the windows while Julian settled into the chair across from him. There was no attorney between them now, no father negotiating from the opposite end of a polished table, no wedding guests pretending that obligation was romance. The $12 million was only the secured portion, Grant said. The words tasted like failure. "There are additional liabilities tied to equipment leases, private notes, and guarantees my father signed through separate entities. If everything is called at once, the exposure could be closer to $17 million. Julian was silent. Grant waited for anger. Instead, Julian asked, "Did my father know?" "I do not know." "Did you?" Grant looked down. "Not when I agreed to the marriage. I found the documents 2 days before the wedding." Julian's fingers became still against the desk. "And you said nothing?" "Because I thought Mercer would cancel the agreement." "So you married me while hiding information that could affect my family." Grant flinched at the accuracy of it. "Yes." Julian turned his face toward the window, listening to the faint hum of traffic several stories below. When he spoke again, disappointment had replaced anger. I thought you resented me because you believed I had purchased you. Now I find out you were frightened I might refuse the purchase. That is not fair. Neither was the contract. Grant had no answer. Julian rose and crossed toward a cabinet with practiced steps. Grant almost moved to help, then stopped himself. Julian found the cabinet handle, opened it, and removed a slim folder marked with a tactile label. There is something you should know too. He placed it on the desk. I never asked my father to make marriage part of the restructuring. Grant stared at him. What? I opposed it. Julian's voice stayed quiet. 3 times. He opened the folder and slid several documents toward Grant. They were letters sent weeks before Grant had ever entered Mercer Holdings. Julian had argued that tying debt relief to marriage created unnecessary legal and ethical risk. Every objection had been rejected. Then why? Did you agree? Grant asked. Julian gave a humorless smile. Probably for the same reason you did. Family. The answer changed the room. Grant had spent weeks imagining a creditor and a debtor, a winner and a loser. Instead, there were simply 2 sons standing inside consequences created by men who claimed to know what was best for them. Grant sat down slowly. So what happens now? Julian returned to his chair. We find out exactly what your father signed, who knew about it, and why my family wanted this marriage badly enough to ignore my objections. Grant studied him. You want to help me investigate Mercer Holdings? I want the truth, even if it damages your family. Julian's expression hardened with quiet resolve, especially if my family created the problem. For the first time since the wedding, Grant felt something other than resentment when he looked at his husband. Respect arrived quietly, almost inconveniently. All right, he said. Partners. Julian extended his hand across the desk. Grant looked at it for a moment before taking it. The gesture was brief, formal, and strangely more meaningful than exchanging rings had been. Julian released him and said, Maybe we married the wrong way. That does not mean we have to become the wrong people. Grant carried those words with him into the evening. Hours later, after Julian had gone upstairs, Grant remained alone with the financial records spread across the library table. One figure appeared repeatedly in the refinancing documents, always routed through different subsidiaries. He checked it once, then twice. The same authorization code connected Callaway's worst loans to a Mercer-controlled investment vehicle established months before the crisis began. Grant stared at the screen as a colder possibility settled over him. Perhaps Mercer Holdings had not simply arrived when his family started drowning. Perhaps someone inside Mercer had known exactly when the water would rise. By 9 the next morning, Grant had slept less than 3 hours, but exhaustion disappeared the moment Julian entered the library. Grant had left the records exactly where he found them, spread across the long table beneath the warm brass lamps. You are awake early, Julian said, recognizing Grant by his footsteps as he crossed the room. I never went to bed. That made Julian stop. Grant guided nothing and moved nothing for him. He simply said, There is a chair about 3 feet in front of you, slightly to your left. Julian found it easily and sat. Grant explained the authorization code, the Mercer-controlled investment vehicle, and the strange timing of the loans. Julian listened without interruption. When Grant finished, the room became quiet except for rain touching the tall windows. There is a board review at 11, Julian said. The chief financial officer will present the restructuring portfolio. Grant understood immediately. Including Callaway? If we are lucky. 2 hours later, they sat side by side in the Mercer Holdings boardroom. Julian wore a soft gray suit, his posture composed, while Grant watched charts appear across a large screen. The chief financial officer, Heir, moved through the presentation with polished confidence. Revenue projections, debt acquisitions, commercial holdings. Then came the restructuring portfolio. Grant felt his pulse quicken when Callaway Industries appeared among the distressed assets. The Callaway position was acquired after substantial deterioration, Warren explained. Julian tilted his head. After? Warren paused. Yes. Julian folded his hands. You sound less certain than you did 30 seconds ago. Several executives shifted in their chairs. Warren gave a small laugh. I am perfectly certain. Then tell me the acquisition date. Papers rustled. March 18th. Julian remained still. And when was the investment vehicle authorized? Another pause. This one lasted longer. Grant looked toward Julian. He could not see Warren checking his notes, but he had heard the hesitation before anyone else recognized its significance. January, Warren finally answered. Julian's voice became quieter. 2 months before the deterioration you just said caused us to acquire the debt. Silence settled over the room. Grant opened the records on his tablet and found the matching authorization code. There is more, he said. He read the number aloud. Julian immediately responded. That code belongs to the same vehicle. Warren began explaining that complex financing structures often required advanced preparation, but Julian did not challenge him further. He simply listened. Grant was beginning to understand that Julian's silence was not surrender. It was space he gave people to reveal more than they intended. When the meeting ended, Julian waited until they were alone in the hallway. He changed his breathing when you read the code, he said. Grant stared at him. You noticed that? I noticed he stopped tapping his pen too. Grant had not even heard the pen. They returned to Julian's office and spent the afternoon comparing dates. By 4:30, a pattern emerged. The Mercer investment vehicle had been established before Callaway's financial crisis became public. Several loans had then been purchased through intermediaries at unusually precise moments, each one increasing pressure on Grant's family. Grant leaned back, staring at the timeline. Someone knew. Julian stood near the window, winter light resting softly across his face. Someone planned. Grant looked at the documents again, and the meaning became impossible to avoid. The marriage was not created to solve the debt. Julian turned toward his voice. For the first time since Grant had met him, genuine unease broke through his controlled expression. No, Julian said. I think the debt may have been created to make the marriage possible. Grant felt the entire foundation of the past several months shift beneath him. Their wedding had seemed like the final consequence of his family's collapse. Now it looked more like a destination someone had been steering them toward from the beginning. Julian crossed the room and stopped beside the table. Their hands rested only inches apart among the financial records. Whatever we find next, he said quietly, we find it together. Grant looked at the man he had once believed represented everything taken from him and realized Julian had become the only person in the room he trusted completely. 3 nights later, Grant stood beside Julian beneath the crystal lights of the Mercer Foundation winter gala and realized how quickly pretending had become unnecessary. The ballroom of a Back Bay hotel glittered with black tuxedos, champagne glasses, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, but Grant barely noticed any of it. Julian stood beside him in a midnight navy suit, one hand resting lightly on his white cane, greeting investors by voice before Grant could remember half their names. They had agreed to attend because canceling would raise questions while they quietly investigated the financial records. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Then Charles Whitmore approached them. Whitmore was an older board member with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to mistaking seniority for wisdom. Julian, he said, I heard about yesterday's portfolio review. Quite impressive. Julian smiled politely. Thank you. Whitmore lowered his voice, although not enough. Still, complicated restructuring work might be better left to people who can review the material directly. There is no shame in letting others handle what your condition makes difficult. Grant felt something inside him go completely still. Julian's expression did not change, but Grant had learned enough to recognize the slight tightening around his mouth. I reviewed the same material everyone else did, Julian replied, in an accessible format. Whitmore chuckled. Of course. I only mean that Mercer Holdings has a reputation to protect. Then it should protect itself from executives who confuse eyesight with competence, Grant said. Whitmore turned. Grant continued before caution could stop him. Julian identified an $800,000 discrepancy in a room full of people who could see the report perfectly well. If reputation is your concern, I would start there. Nearby conversations softened. Whitmore's face changed, but Grant did not care. I meant no offense. Then next time, make sure your words match your intention. Whitmore excused himself moments later. Julian remained silent until they reached a quieter corridor outside the ballroom. Why did you do that? He asked. Do what? Defend me. Grant frowned. Because he was wrong. The agreement does not require you to challenge Mercer board members on my behalf. There was no contract in that room. The words came out before Grant could examine them. Julian became very still. Something softened in his face, subtle enough that Grant might have missed it weeks earlier. "Thank you," Julian said. They returned to the gala, but something between them had shifted. Later, while standing near the windows, Julian asked, "What does the harbor look like tonight?" Grant glanced outside. Dark blue, almost black. The lights on the water looked like someone scattered gold coins across glass. Julian smiled. "That was unnecessarily poetic. I can make it worse." "Please do." Grant described the snow beginning to collect along the railing, the ridiculous emerald bow tie worn by one executive, and the enormous centerpiece that looked more like a frozen tree than flowers. Julian laughed, quietly at first, then without restraint. Grant found himself watching him instead of the harbor. Over the next several days, the habit followed them home. Grant described the morning sky while Julian made coffee. He mentioned the colors of storefronts during their drive through Beacon Hill. Julian never asked him to do it, but Grant discovered he liked giving him details, not because Julian needed them, but because sharing them made ordinary moments feel strangely intimate. One evening, as snow tapped softly against the library windows, Julian closed his laptop and said, "You have changed." Grant looked up. "How?" "When we met, every silence between us felt like something you wanted to escape." Julian turned toward his voice. "Now you stay even when there is nothing left to discuss." Grant realized they had finished working nearly 40 minutes earlier. He could have gone upstairs. Instead, he had remained across from Julian with a cooling cup of coffee, listening to music neither of them had chosen. "Maybe I like the silence now," Grant said. Julian smiled. Grant felt the answer settle somewhere deeper than he wanted to examine, because for the first time, the investigation was no longer the only reason he wanted to remain beside his husband. By the middle of January, Grant could no longer remember exactly when living with Julian had stopped feeling temporary. Perhaps it happened on the morning Julian began leaving a second mug beside the coffee maker because he knew Grant would appear at 7:30. Perhaps it was the night Grant returned late from Callaway Industries and found Julian asleep in the library with an audiobook still playing softly through one earpiece. Or perhaps it happened gradually, hidden inside 100 ordinary moments neither man had intended to create. Their investigation continued, but the hours between discoveries began to matter just as much. Grant learned that Julian preferred jazz when working and classical piano when he could not sleep. Julian learned that Grant skipped breakfast whenever he was anxious and began ordering enough food for two without mentioning it. On walks through Beacon Hill, Grant stopped instinctively reaching for Julian whenever they approached a curb. Instead, he walked beside him, giving simple information when necessary and trusting Julian to decide what help he wanted. One snowy Saturday morning, they walked nearly a mile to a small coffee shop Julian had loved since college. "You are finally learning," Julian said as they waited at a crosswalk. "Learning what?" "How to walk with me instead of managing me." Grant smiled. "That sounds suspiciously like praise. Do not become arrogant." "Too late." Julian laughed, and Grant felt the sound follow him for the rest of the day. That evening, they returned to Mercer House as snow covered the garden in several inches of white. The investigation had produced another important document linking Warren Hale to the investment vehicle, but instead of celebrating, Grant became quiet. Julian noticed immediately. "What happened?" "Nothing. That answer has never worked on me." Grant stood beside the fireplace. "My father called." He apologized again. Julian waited. Grant stared into the amber light. "I keep thinking I should have seen what was happening sooner. I was working at the company. I should have asked questions." "You were his son, Grant, not his auditor. People could have lost everything. And you were willing to give up your future to protect them." Grant looked toward Julian. "That does not erase what I missed." "No, but carrying your father's mistakes forever will not repair them either." The gentleness in Julian's voice made Grant's defenses feel suddenly exhausting. He sat beside him on the couch. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Julian lifted one hand, but stopped before touching him. "May I?" Grant understood. "Yes." Julian's fingertips rested lightly against Grant's face, first at his temple, then along the line of his cheek and jaw. The touch was careful, almost thoughtful, as if Julian were reading an expression Grant had spent years learning to hide. Grant barely breathed. "You are frowning," Julian said. "I am thinking." "Dangerous habit." Grant laughed softly. Julian smiled, but his hand remained against Grant's cheek for another heartbeat before slowly falling away. Something unspoken filled the space between them. Grant wanted to say that Mercer House felt different when Julian was not in a room. He wanted to admit that he had started measuring his days by Julian's laughter, his footsteps, the quiet conversations after midnight. Instead, his phone rang. Grant glanced at the screen. Their attorney. He answered, and within seconds the warmth in his chest turned into disbelief. New evidence had confirmed that the Callaway loans had been improperly manipulated. With the documents they had gathered, the restructuring could be challenged and the remaining debt eliminated. Grant ended the call slowly. Julian was waiting. What did they say? Grant looked at his husband. The man he had once believed was the price of his freedom. We found it, he whispered. The debt can be cleared. Julian smiled, but the expression did not reach the rest of his face. For the first time, freedom sounded less like an ending they had both wanted and more like a question neither of them was ready to answer. The news should have felt like victory, but during the next 4 days, Grant discovered that freedom could be frightening when it threatened to take away the life he had accidentally learned to love. Their attorneys moved quickly. The authorization records, altered valuations, and internal correspondence were enough to challenge the Callaway restructuring, and Mercer Holdings agreed to suspend every disputed obligation while an independent review proceeded. By Friday afternoon, Grant sat in a downtown Boston law office listening as an attorney explained that the marriage provision could no longer be enforced. The words were clinical and simple. Grant was free. So was Julian. Yet on the drive back to Beacon Hill, Grant felt no relief. Julian sat beside him in silence, listening to the soft rhythm of tires against wet pavement. You should be happy, Julian finally said. Grant looked toward him. So should you. Julian gave a faint smile. Perhaps we are both tired. They said nothing else. That evening, Grant stood alone in the library with the dissolution agreement resting on the table. He had requested it himself. He told himself it was the honorable thing to do. Julian had never chosen the original arrangement. If Grant truly cared about him, then he could not allow obligation to remain between them simply because Grant had become afraid of losing what came after it. Julian entered a few minutes later, his cane tapping softly across the hardwood floor. You wanted to speak with me? Grant's throat tightened. Yes. He described the document and placed it near Julian's hand. Julian touched the first page, then connected his earpiece so his phone could read the digital copy their attorney had sent. Grant listened to the mechanical voice fill the room, each sentence removing another legal thread that had tied them together. When it ended, Julian asked, You already signed it? Yes. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. I see, Julian said softly. Grant hated those 2 words. Julian, this is what we wanted. It is what we wanted when we were strangers. Grant looked at him, but Julian's expression had become carefully controlled. I will not keep you inside a marriage you never chose. And you think signing this for me gives me a choice? Grant froze. Julian drew a slow breath. You decided what freedom should look like, then handed it to me completed. I was trying to do the right thing. I know. That gentleness hurt more than anger would have. Julian placed his hand flat against the document. That is what makes this difficult. Grant wanted to tell him everything. He wanted to say that the first sound he listened for each morning was Julian moving downstairs. That coffee tasted different when there was only 1 mug on the counter. That he had stopped thinking of Mercer House as Julian's home weeks ago because somewhere along the way it had become theirs. But fear translated every feeling into restraint. Now you never have to wonder whether I stayed because I owed you, Grant said. Julian turned toward his voice. His blue-gray eyes remained calm, but his breathing changed. And you never have to wonder whether I would have asked you to stay. Grant felt the meaning too late. Julian stood. I will never ask someone to remain with me because they feel obligated. He paused near the doorway. But I wish you had asked what I wanted before deciding that leaving was kindness. The next morning, Grant packed 2 suitcases. Julian did not come downstairs. Grant waited beside the front door longer than necessary, listening to the house that had once felt too large and formal and now seemed painfully familiar. Finally, he left. Callaway Industries welcomed him back with relieved employees, restored accounts, and congratulations that followed him through every hallway. His family's home was secure. The company would survive. Everything he had sacrificed himself to save was finally his again. That night, Grant stood alone in his old apartment overlooking the Charles River, surrounded by proof that he had won. There was no jazz playing from another room. No second coffee mug waiting for morning. No quiet voice noticing what Grant was trying not to say. He had spent months believing debt was the chain keeping him beside Julian. Only after breaking it did Grant understand the truth. The contract had forced him to marry Julian, but nothing had forced him to fall in love with him. For 6 days, Grant lived inside the life he had fought so hard to recover and discovered that almost nothing in it felt like home anymore. Callaway Industries was stabilizing. Employees who had spent months fearing layoffs were receiving confirmation that their jobs were secure. His father had stepped away from financial decisions, and independent auditors were rebuilding the company around safeguards that should have existed years earlier. Grant should have felt proud. Instead, every morning at 7:30, he reached automatically for a second coffee mug before remembering there was nobody waiting for it. He missed Jazz drifting through the library. He missed Julian correcting his terrible descriptions of expensive art. He missed the quiet tilt of Julian's head whenever Grant tried to hide something behind a careless answer. Most of all, Grant missed being known. On Thursday afternoon, the independent review finally delivered its findings. Warren Hale had used Mercer-controlled entities and confidential financial information to increase pressure on Callaway at carefully selected moments. Internal correspondence showed that he believed a marriage between the families would consolidate influence, strengthen his position inside Mercer Holdings, and make both companies easier to control through a single alliance. Harrison Mercer had approved aggressive restructuring without understanding the full manipulation behind it, but his willingness to treat Julian's future as a business solution had allowed the plan to succeed. Warren resigned before the board could remove him. The disputed Callaway obligations were formally canceled, and the remaining legitimate debt was converted into ordinary commercial terms with no connection to Grant's marriage. By 5 o'clock, there was nothing left binding Grant to Julian. No hidden clause, no financial threat, no family expectation. Grant sat alone in his office holding the final document and suddenly understood what freedom was actually for. It was not the right to leave. It was the right to choose where to return. He drove to Beacon Hill through light evening snow, his heart beating harder with every familiar block. Mercer House appeared beneath warm exterior lights, unchanged from the morning he had left. Grant climbed the steps and stopped at the door. For once, he had no contract in his hand, no attorney beside him, and no carefully prepared argument. He rang the bell. A housekeeper admitted him and said Julian was in the library. Grant knew the way. He found Julian sitting near the fireplace in an ivory sweater, an audiobook paused beside him. Julian lifted his head before Grant spoke. Grant. Hearing his name nearly broke every sentence Grant had rehearsed during the drive. How did you know? Julian's expression softened slightly. Your shoes. You still hesitated doorways. Grant laughed once, but emotion tightened his throat. The review is finished. Warren is gone. The debt arrangement has been corrected. There is nothing connecting Callaway to our marriage anymore. Julian became quiet. I am glad. I am not. Julian's brow tightened. Grant stepped closer. I thought loving you meant giving you freedom from me. I was wrong. I made another decision for you because I was afraid to ask the question that mattered. Julian stood slowly. What question? Grant stopped several feet away, leaving the distance for Julian to choose. Whether you wanted me to stay. Silence filled the library. Grant continued before fear could stop him. I spent my whole life believing love was something you proved by sacrificing what you wanted. Then I met you, and somehow you taught me that love is also listening, choosing, staying when nobody requires it. Julian's breathing became unsteady. Grant, I cleared every obligation that brought me here. I can walk away tonight without owing your family $1. His voice softened. And that is how I finally know I do not want to. Julian moved toward him, counting the familiar steps without his cane. When he reached Grant, his hand found Grant's sleeve, then rested against his chest. Why did you come back? Grant covered Julian's hand gently with his own. Because everything I wanted to save means less when I cannot share my life with you. Julian was silent for a long moment. Then the tension in his face eased into the smallest, warmest smile Grant had ever seen. You took 6 days to figure that out. Grant laughed through the ache in his chest. I have never claimed to be efficient. Julian's fingers tightened lightly around his hand. Grant looked at the man who was no longer an obligation, an heir, or a symbol of his family's debt. Julian was simply Julian, and Grant was finally standing beside him for the only reason that mattered. He had chosen to come home. Grant did not ask Julian to restore what they had lost. He asked if they could build something new. For the next 3 months, they dated with an awkwardness that made Julian laugh and Grant strangely nervous. There were dinners in small Boston restaurants where nobody knew their last names, Saturday walks through Beacon Hill, quiet Sunday mornings with jazz playing while Julian made coffee, and long conversations that no longer ended when the business questions were answered. Grant moved back into Mercer House gradually, not because a contract assigned him a room there, but because one toothbrush became 2, one coffee mug became 2, and eventually his charcoal coats appeared beside Julian's navy ones near the front door. Spring arrived slowly in Massachusetts. One April evening, Grant took Julian to the small coffee shop they had walked to during the winter. Afterward, they followed the familiar route home beneath trees just beginning to bloom. When they reached the quiet garden behind Mercer House, Grant stopped. "There is something I need to ask you." Julian smiled. "Your voice just changed." "I am nervous." "That is new." Grant laughed softly, then reached into his coat pocket. "The first time we married, there were attorneys, financial statements, and 2 families making decisions before either of us had the chance to decide what we wanted." Julian became still. Grant stepped closer. "I cannot change how our story started, but I can ask how you want it to continue." He took Julian's hand and placed a small ring box against his palm. Julian's fingers closed around it. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Julian said quietly, "Ask me again." Grant understood immediately. His throat tightened. "Julian Mercer, will you marry me because you choose me, and for no other reason?" Julian's smile carried none of the restraint Grant remembered from their first ceremony. Yes. Their second wedding was held 6 weeks later in the garden behind Mercer House. There were no corporate negotiations waiting in another room. No debt documents. No strategic announcements. Grant's parents attended as family rather than representatives of a failing company, and Harrison Mercer sat quietly among the guests after offering Julian something he should have given him years earlier, an apology without conditions. When Grant and Julian exchanged vows, Grant described the late afternoon sky because he knew Julian liked knowing the colors. "Soft blue," he whispered. "Gold near the trees." Julian smiled. "Better than your harbor description. I have been practicing." A year later, Callaway Industries and Mercer Holdings remained separate companies, connected only through ordinary partnerships approved by independent boards. Grant rebuilt Callaway around transparency his father had neglected, while Julian became executive chairman of Mercer Holdings and expanded accessibility programs across the company. Their marriage belonged to neither corporation. That boundary mattered to them. On the anniversary of their second wedding, they attended the Mercer Foundation Gala at the same Back Bay hotel where Grant had once defended Julian before a room full of executives. Near the end of the evening, Julian found Grant beside the windows overlooking Boston Harbor. "What are you looking at?" Julian asked. Grant smiled. "The water. The lights are gold again, still like coins scattered across glass. I was hoping you had forgotten that." "Never." Julian slipped one hand around Grant's arm. He did not need Grant to guide him through the familiar ballroom. Grant knew that. Julian knew Grant knew it. The gesture meant something entirely different now. It meant closeness, choice, home. They walked toward the elevators together. "Ready?" Grant asked. Julian tilted his head. "For what?" "To go home." Julian's expression softened. "Where is home tonight?" Grant glanced at him. "Beacon Hill, unless you secretly bought another house." Julian laughed. "I meant something less literal." Grant understood, but he let the silence stretch between them because silence no longer frightened either of them. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Julian squeezed Grant's arm and smiled. "Wherever you are." Grant had once believed freedom meant having nothing left to owe. Now he understood it differently. Freedom was standing beside someone when every door was open, every obligation was gone, and neither person had any reason to stay except love. Together, they stepped forward, not because anyone had arranged their future, but because this time they had chosen it themselves.